the end of the war, the major question was how would the defeated Confederacy be treated? Would they treat them as conquered states? Or would they treat them as what they actually came to, as indissoluble states that were a part of an indestructible union? The Constitution is eloquent on who has the power to reconstruct, because we didn't think that anyone would ever have the job of reconstructing. Lincoln, as president, felt that it was the responsibility of the president. And toward the end of the war, he came up with what was called the 10% plan. According to his plan, we were an indestructible union made up of indissoluble states. And these states that had seceded from the Union would need to be reconstructed back into the Union. And when 10% of the people in the, quote, defeated, end of quote, states had taken a pledge of allegiance to the Union, then they would be eligible as a state to come back into the Union. Unfortunately, Lincoln was assassinated. Johnson became president of the States. And then there was the struggle: who will reconstruct, the president or the Congress? The Congress came up with a plan that would, in essence, in some ways, punish the Confederacy. The whole of the South was divided into 5 military districts, and a general was in charge of each of the districts. And as those districts adhered to the guidelines established by the Congress, they could be reconstructed into the Union. Now, he did not go with the 10% plan. Those persons who had been leaders in the Confederacy would have to take a pledge of allegiance to the Union, and they would not be permitted to vote or participate in the government that was being established. Then they wanted and insisted that they accept an amendment that legally freed all the slaves, and another that gave the vote to the slaves. Notice what happened then, that as the vote was taken from what had been the leadership in the South, the newly freed slaves were empowered to vote. The Republic that to establish their government and help to put a number of Negroes in office. And in some places, the Reconstruction was very difficult. Now, Reconstruction as a subject in history only lasted for 10 years. And then with the election of 1870, there was a compromise that we will discuss later. But there are several things that I want to mention before David starts talking, and that is the compassion, the sense of leadership and responsibility expressed by Lincoln, particularly in his second inaugural address. And from that address, we have the phrase that we hopefully will come together with malice toward none, charity toward all. In other words, charity towards the defeated Confederacy. We are not going to treat them as though they are a defeated people, but with charity and with malice toward none. With Lincoln, that very fine feeling seemed to a considerable extent to have disappeared. Georgetown was particularly important in the Reconstruction because of the kind of understanding that was worked out here. During the latter years of the war, there was conducted in Port Royal, near Beaufort or Beaufort Sound, an experiment that has been called the Port Royal experiment. It was one of the first places that the Union soldiers were able to take. And the slave owners left the sea islands where they had been growing cotton, and their plantations were taken over by the slaves. At first, the soldiers that were in charge gave them the right to take that property and to work it as their own. And then they sent down people to teach them how to plant and to establish schools and how to become assimilated into the American culture. One of the very first schools for Negroes, public schools for Negroes in the state, was established on Penn Island, the Penn School. Quakers came down and took over the leadership in that school. Among them was a Negro woman, Charlotte Fortune, who later married one of the Grimke brothers that we talked about at the last meeting of the class. Later on, however, as government was established, it was determined that the slaves could not keep that land, that they would have to give it back to the owners. They would have to give it back to the planters to which it was owned. Now, I just want to introduce to you the Port Royal plan. And that was one of the very distinctive things in this state. And David mentioned at the last meeting of the class the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau that was established to help not only the newly freed slaves, but really anyone in need. It was short-lived, however, but it did do some good. Now, I think that's about the structure in which we want to look at the Reconstruction, except for one other thing. The 54th of Massachusetts was established, and it was made up of volunteer Negroes, mostly from the North, under the leadership of a Captain Shaw, whose parents were outstanding abolitionists. For a short time, they were here, and we'll come back to that. But I think at this point, I'd like to ask David if he will share with you the detail of Reconstruction in Georgetown. He knows much more about that than I do.
Reconstruction in Georgetown, Reconstruction in South Carolina. Started with the Constitutional Convention of 1868. The convention that the white South Carolinians didn't want. They didn't want to reconstruct a constitution. They had one, and it was working the way they wanted it to work. So they did not want to reconstruct the Constitution, but they had orders from Washington that if you're going to be accepted back into the Union, you have to reconstruct your Constitution to the extent that, as the word is, all men are created equal, that all men have voting right, property right, etc., and not just white. But they said that the entire process would be controlled by the number of individuals participating. The whites decided that they would register in large numbers, which they did, but they wouldn't attend the convention. Black registered in large numbers and attended the convention. As a result, the 1868 Constitution of South Carolina was written practically entirely by blacks. The first legislature of South Carolina was controlled practically by black because whites stayed away. They made the first law for education, which helped not only the black, but helped the poor white. South Carolina was an elitist state. The rich and the well-to-do controlled everything. Nothing that passed was sent to the people to approve. The legislature did it. In 1868, Constitutional Convention, a Reverend Richard Harvey Kane, a black minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, proposed to the convention that they provide land for the freedmen, that they had all of these slaves out, but with no property, and that some provision should be made so that they could obtain property. They didn't do it in 1868, but in 1869, they passed a land commission law, and they appointed a land commissioner and 10 sub-land commissioners. The land commissioner was Charlie P. Leslie, a white. The 10 sub-land commissioners, 8 of them were black. One of them was Joseph Rainey of Georgetown, who came back to Georgetown and with federal funds purchased nearly 7,000 acres of property. And as a result, that's why you ride through the historical district of Georgetown today and you see black and white living, in a lot of cases, side by side. The historical district is entirely integrated. Why? Because a black man was in charge of the land and blacks could get land wherever they wanted. Not only did they get the land, but they held on to it. I do tours in Georgetown, and I start my tour from Bethel AME Church, which is the first black church organized in Georgetown after the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was in 1863. Bethel was organized in 1865. Most of my tour guests are white, and they are amazed that right across from Bethel is the Jewish cemetery. Right in the next block is the Bluebird Prince George Cemetery, Catholic church. They want to know, how is it that you get a black church and all of this white? So I had to explain to them what happened. That when land was issued out originally in 1869, 1870, a black man was in charge of the process. And so blacks were able to get property wherever they wanted. Not only did they get it, but they got it and they held on to it. Slavery was a ruthless institution, but something good comes out of everything that's bad. There are two processes in the rice plantation that turned out to be advantageous to the slave. One was the task system, where every slave was assigned a task every morning, which was supposed to be a task that was hard enough it would take him in the 9 hours that the day was to complete. And if he completed in less than 9 hours, the rest of the time was his. Slaves used that time to rent their services out to other plantations. They grew crops. They raised hogs, chickens, eggs. All of these the master bought from them, which meant from time to time the slave had a little change in his pocket. Another thing about rice culture was that a rice plantation had to be like a city. There's no city to send to. Whatever skill was needed had to be on the plantation. If they needed a blacksmith, had to have it on the plantation. Seamstress, and they made all the clothes for the slaves and the family, had to be on the plantation. Carpenter, all of those fine houses on these plantations were built by slaves. But you had to have those skills on the plantation. And in some cases, if there was skill needed and not anyone there to do it, to perform that skill, they would send the most aggressive slave off and have that slave trained in the skill needed and brought back to the plantation and put to work. So at the end of the Civil War, when slaves were free, you had hundreds of slaves coming into Georgetown who not only had $1 or $2 in their pocket, but they had skills. From 1865 to 1910, Front Street in Georgetown was practically black business-wise. Slaves who were performing tasks on plantations for free came into Georgetown and put their tasks to work, which they were paid for. And as a result, the businesses on Front Street, up until around 1910, the majority of the businesses were owned and operated by blacks. Because of the strong Republican emphasis in the Republican Party in Georgetown, blacks were elected immediately after beginning with 1868 to all sorts of positions in city government. Reconstruction started in 1867 and lasted until 1877. The fusion plan, which gave where the whites and the blacks in Georgetown agreed that no group would monopolize any of the elected or appointed positions, but would share them equally. It didn't start until 1879. 1879 in the city and 1880 in the city and county. But because of the strong voting power of blacks in Georgetown, blacks were elected to positions in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, and the city government from 1868 on to 1902. Reconstruction lasted 10 years. In Georgetown, it lasted for 25 years. And it lasted until September of 1900, when an incident that we'll discuss later on Front Street almost ended up in a riot and brought it to a close. Blacks owned property, owned businesses. Blacks worked in the government. 3 blacks were probate judges. 3 were postmasters. 1, George Harrod, was superintendent of education from 1880 to 1902. Blacks served in all positions in the city and county government in Georgetown during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, because of the strength of the Republican Party in Georgetown. The population, according to Edgar, in Georgetown in 1879 was 82% black. The voting strength of blacks during that period was 100,000 votes, exceeded the white. Whites had to sign a pledge of allegiance and swear allegiance to the Union in order to be able to vote. And a lot of them just refused to do it. And as a result, they were not allowed to vote. And blacks carried the voting power in South Carolina for a number of years, up until the 1895 Constitutional Convention. When they included, you had to read and write and interpret any section of the Constitution that the registrar gave you in order to be able to vote. You had to pay tax on property value at $5,000 or more. You could not have been guilty of vagrancy, larceny, petty crimes. If you were found guilty of those, then you couldn't vote. Murder and rape wasn't included. You could be convicted of murder and rape, but you could vote. But those others, And so that eliminated a lot of blacks from the voting roll. And the blacks were incensed when it came to an end in 1900 over the Brownfield incident because they felt that was their number. They should have been able to elect whoever they wanted to anything. Well, they did for a long time. It came to an end in 1900. Negro senators, Rainey, 1868 to 1870. Then he was elected to the United States Congress, where he served 5 terms. William H. Jones served in the Senate 1872 to 1876. Bruce Williams served the Senate in South Carolina from Georgetown in 1876 to 1888. Then he became a minister and was a pastor at Bethel Church. And about 12 other blacks served in the South Carolina House of Representatives, all from Georgetown, South Carolina. That is some of Reconstruction in Georgetown. It isn't all, but it brings you up to 1900 when we had this incident on Front Street that brought Reconstruction to an end. John Brownfield, a black barber, well liked in the black community, was a barber on Front Street. On one Saturday in September, officer sheriff, a deputy, went to the barber shop. Now this story, I'm telling you, I don't believe it was a cuss, but this is the only story I've been able to get out of anybody. Deputy sheriff went to the barber shop to complain to Brownfield that he hadn't paid his tax. I wondered if Brownfield was the only black who hadn't paid his tax. If it was more of that, then the deputy had a whole big job on his hands to go to all of them, but Brownfield was the one he went to. And the discussion about him not paying his tax got so heated that it became physical. Brownfield got hold of the deputy's pistol some way. He dropped it or wrestled it from him and shot the deputy not once, emptied the gun into the deputy for not paying a tax. Kill him. Almost had a riot in Georgetown. Whites planned to lynch Brownfield, but they talked about it in front of their black servants who went back to the black neighborhood and told them that they're going to lynch Brownfield. The blacks said, well, what we'll do, we'll ring the fire alarm. When the whites go to the fire, we'll go to the jail. They rang the fire alarm, the whites went to the fire where they thought the fire was, the blacks went to the jail. The rifles, sticks, everything they could carry. And it was a hot time for a little while. But some of these same black politicians who'd been elected cooled things down, and they were able to maintain peace in Georgetown. Brownfield was tried, found guilty, sentenced to hang. The lawyer appealed it. Tried again, found guilty, and sentenced to hang. Went from the appeal court to the Supreme Court, State Supreme Court, to the United States Supreme Court. And then after the United States Supreme Court, he came back and his lawyer asked for habeas corpus restriction. And one morning, when the jailer walked up into the jail cell and opened the Brownfield door, he was dead. The word is that he committed suicide. I've never been able to find out what he committed suicide with, what he took, what happened. But he committed suicide. And at that date, in September of 1900, they discontinued the fusion plan, which had been used in Beaufort, Berkeley County, had been tried in Charleston, but the politicians abolished it in Charleston, but it lasted in Georgetown longer than it did any place else in the state of South Carolina until 1900. But that incident brought the fusion plan and the sharing of elected positions to an end. After 1900, John William Bolt was the last black elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. He was elected in 1898 and served until 1902. After that, no other black from Georgetown served in the South Carolina House of Representatives until during the 60s when Ted Brown was elected. But that brought Reconstruction, Fusion Plan, and most of Georgetown's progressive move to an end. If you want to get another picture of it, read A History of Black America by LaRon Bennett. That's where it came from. Also, read Edgar's South Carolina history. Edgar has a nice article. The most successful fusion plan was that in Georgetown County. Black population 82%. Republicans and Democrats decided to share offices in town election in 1879 and the following year in county election. Each party nominated candidates for specific offices, and the other party agreed not to nominate anyone to oppose them. The Democrat nominated the sheriff, clerk of court, 2 county commissioners, 1 state representative, and the Republican nominated the state senator, 1 representative, probate judge, school commissioner, and 1 county commissioner. With the exception of 1 white Republican probate judge, all the other Republican office holders were black. White Georgetown honored Wade Hampton's pledge to the black community, and the black community was willing to assert itself. The Georgetown plan worked successfully, although grudgingly, until 1900 when a race riot, the one we just talked about, ended it. If you get a chance to read Edgar's, not only on South Carolina, on this section, but read Edgar on South Carolina after the Civil War. South Carolina never did stop Civil War. They just stopped the method of fighting it, from guns to politics and movement. With the federal government supporting blacks, they were able to do whatever they wanted to. And white took advantage of them. You would walk country roads in South Carolina and find blacks dead all alongside the road, men and women, for all sorts of things, for not moving off the sidewalk to let white come by, for being disrespectful and speaking to white, all sorts of things. As long as the Union, the Northerners were behind South Carolina in strength at the first beginning, they were able to keep everything in line, but then everything got to be politics and business. And they lost the support of the individual who could protect them. And as a result, with the Constitutional Convention of 1895, South Carolina got back to where they wanted to be. What I just passed out to you is the mastermind, one of the pushers behind the fusion plan, George E. Harriet, who not only was the pusher behind the fusion plan, but for a long time was the chairman of the Republican Party in Georgetown. And he also served as superintendent of education from 1880 to 1902. So that was the individual who was responsible for the pushing of the fusion plan in Georgetown. They had it in Georgetown, Beaufort, and Berkeley County. They tried it a little in Charleston, but it didn't work. Well, they didn't allow it to work. But it was most successful in Georgetown than any place else. And at the end of the fusion plan, we came to Jim Crow.